Hey, Tom here. Recently, I have had the itch to do some traditional sculpting. I have been working on a lot of different projects for different clients, a few things for myself, but they've all been digital, and I realized that I have sort of neglected the traditional side of things, and it's something I wanted to get back to. So while I was at Hobby Lobby with my daughter, getting some various art supplies and other arts and crafts things, I thought it was the perfect time to go check out the clay section, see what they had to offer. And I'll get into that in just a second. So when I was starting to think about what I was going to sculpt, what I wanted to do for my next video, I was thinking about a comment that I get quite frequently, which is to do more videos about sculpting faces, do an update, and I thought that was the perfect time to do this. So this video is going to be kind of pulling double duty. One, I'm going to do a refresher on how I sculpt faces, but at the same time I'm going to talk about some new clay that I tried for this process. Now you're going to see me working on two different heads, or at least getting two different heads started. So I'll start by telling you what I've got going on here. In this initial one, I'm using a brass rod that's 0.8 millimeters thick. And for both of these, I am not sculpting these heads on a miniature. I'm sculpting them free form. But what's cool about doing this technique, it's a great way to practice faces because you don't have to worry about making a whole miniature. You just get a thin piece of metal and start sculpting a head. You can always clip it off, add it to a figure later. Once I have that done, I crimp the top, give it a little bend. That's just to create a little hook just to help the material hold on there. And then I start mixing up green stuff like you see here. And once you have the green stuff all mixed up, you go ahead and apply it to the top hook part there. And the reason you're doing this, the reason I do this, is whenever I'm sculpting with poly clay, I always put down a layer of putty first. This helps the poly clay stick better to the material. If you just try and go straight onto the wire with most poly clay, everything but bees putty, it will just slip right off. It's not tacky enough. So you use this layer of green stuff to apply, and then while it still hasn't cured, so it's still got a lot of stickiness, that's when you're going to apply a layer of the poly clay. Oh, and I'm remiss if I don't add, I'm using a color shaper here to apply the green stuff. You can use any sculpting tool, but I love these color shapers or clay shapers because they just don't stick to the putty. Now that we have the wire prepped, it's time to add our poly clay. In this case, the first clay that I got from Hobby Lobby was Sculpey 3. I had always seen this at the store and thought maybe this would be a good alternative. And it possibly is. As you can see, I'm stretching and pulling it here just to show you a little bit of the texture and feel. It's very supple and can stretch out into nice, fine, thin parts. But what I realized as I started working with this poly clay is that it was way too soft for my needs. And I will get into a little bit more about it when I talk about the clay that I ended up using to finish this demo. I really didn't get much farther than you're seeing here. I went ahead and applied a thin layer of the clay over the green stuff to get the head started, and started to add on and bulk up a little bit more to just get the form of the face. But because of how soft it was, it just wasn't working for me. I am glad I did it though, because it's good to experiment with other materials and try things, see what's out there, because you never know when your pet material, your prime material, will go away. But I also know what I need in order to do good sculpting work, and this soft material was not it. So with that, let's jump on over to attempt number 2. So for attempt number 2, I started with a traditional 24 gauge steel, galvanized steel wire, which is really my go-to for making armatures of any kind. And with these, you can crimp them to create a little more texture like I did with the brass wire. But in most cases with this, I just twist it into a little hook like you see there. And I'm going to go ahead and just do exactly the same as I did in the last one. Mix up some green stuff, start getting that applied to the little hook, and then I will start applying the other polyclay that I got to try out. Oh yeah, and don't forget, you can use your fingers to do a lot of this initial application of the green stuff. If you get the right shape and thin enough, just pinch it on there. You don't have to use a special tool. So after giving Sculpey 3 a try, I went back to the store and picked up Sculpey Premo. I had done some research, and I should have done it ahead of time, but I was in the store and I was excited to try some new clay. But I did some research and I found out that Sculpey 3 is sort of an analog to Fimo Soft, and if you don't know what that is, that's Fimo Professional is what I typically use to sculpt in polyclay, and Fimo Soft is not as durable, not as pliable or supple, and it's definitely a lot softer. And it's the same for Sculpey 3. Sculpey Premo, right away I could tell with using it that it was a lot closer to Fimo Professional. I will say it was still significantly softer than what I'm used to, and I'm not somebody who likes really strong or firm clay, hard clay, but I also don't like it really soft. It's can be very challenging, especially I think it's also challenging for newer sculptors at times to have the soft clay, because you have to have just such an exceptionally light touch in order for it to work. I have been teaching people how to sculpt miniatures for years, and I have so many videos that you can check out on so many subjects. If you haven't already, click the link down in the description below to get my ultimate quick start guide to sculpting miniatures. It breaks down all the main components to sculpting miniatures and shows you just what videos to go to find out how to do the specific things you're trying to do with sculpting miniatures. Alright, let's get back to sculpting this head. One thing that you can do if you are working with a softer clay, and I didn't do that here because I was a little impatient, I just wanted to get into it, is you can actually bulk up the form with green stuff a little more first. So, you put that initial skin, and this works better on larger parts like the head. If you're doing an arm, usually a thin skin is sufficient, but when you're doing something with like a face which has a lot of details and some very distinct structures, it's actually a good idea to put a little bit more putty on. You can put an initial layer and a thin, not thin, but a slightly formed structure of the face, but you need it to be way smaller. But that starts to give a little more grounding. Then you put another thin layer of green stuff on top of that, then add your clay, and that gives you a good understructure and blocking. And you will see here that I end up struggling with that a little bit as I sculpt, especially when putting on the initial chunks, because whenever you're putting on polyclay, it's warmed up, it's fresh, it's conditioned, and so you have to be a little careful when you're working really fast and putting a lot on at once, because it wants to stay in that malleable state. Once you let it be for a little bit, it starts to cool. You get a little bit, it's a little more forgiving when it comes to the manipulation. It wants to hold its shape a little better, but in this case it was still pretty soft, and so I was still having to be very gentle as I was working with this material. Once you get the general shape of the face, of the whole head I should say, in position, I like to take my clay shaper and start to create an eye line there. It starts to put a little bit of the divot where the eye is going to go. It creates the shelf of the cheekbone and just starts to help you see the proportion and where everything is going to need to go on the face. And be sure while you're doing this, before you start getting in there and doing all these little adjustments like we're doing now, make sure you get your ruler out or your reference head and make sure that the head itself is the right size. It's very easy at the scale, especially when you don't have the head on the figure, where you can get a sense of if it looks right or not. It's very easy to sculpt a little too big, a little too small, my case, I have a tendency to go too large. And once you have that dialed in, it's time to start adding on a little bit of clay for the nose. A lot of sculptors will try and draw the material out of the face, and that can work, but especially when you're working with polyclay, I find it much easier to tackle by adding in the additional material. You don't end up distorting and morphing the entire face shape, and you can add a little more, trim a little off, and get exactly what you need for the nose. Key here is once you get it tapped into place is to start to blend it in, and I use the clay shaper, I use a small burnishing tool, whatever you need to do, whatever you're most comfortable with, to just blend that clay into place. Now, using a scalpel, we're going to cut in the mouth and start to define the eyeballs themselves. So with this, I like to just press in with the point to the outside of the mouth on each side, just to create a little bit of a line there. Having the point on the outside creates a little bit of an extra divot, which helps define the mouth, but we'll go back in with some other tools to play and manipulate that, but it's a good start. And then for the eyes, and you can see this reflected in another video with some additional illustration going on, but I basically create two sideways V's where the openings, the tops if you will, point at each other. So you've got a little point of the V starting at where your nose begins, and then a point of another V on the other side. And it's always a little tricky to do the different sides of the eyes. You know, you can see here I like to flip the head upside down in order to help get my tool in there just right. But I always have to end up going back in with a little bit of extra manipulation just to try and make the eyes even. Another really important thing to do when you're working on your face is, I mentioned earlier, you need to measure it, make sure it's the right size, you got the right proportions. But every now and then you might find once you get the mouth and the eyes in that some of the shape isn't quite there, or maybe you don't have enough material. So here you can see I'm adding in a little bit more to further define the jaw and just make that give that a nicer form. I realized that the chin was going to be way too diminutive for the type of look I was going for, and rather than trying to pull out, I just added up on a little more material. The downside to this, when you don't kind of have that all really worked out and nailed in, is that you will start to distort certain elements. So you're going to see that my mouth is starting to get crunched up a little bit, kind of looking like a funny expression. And I will say and clarify that the main reason I'm having to do this here is I was not doing what I preached a minute ago, which is to make sure you are measuring the head frequently. You're measuring where the eyes are falling, where the mouth is falling, and the overall size of the head itself. You can see here now it's starting to look a little rough. I've jumped ahead, I started to blend in a little bit, but I really need to kind of refine that and define the extra material that I added a little more. It's okay if you have some rough spots, especially when you're finalizing the general shape of the head, to leave some of those rough spots, but you do want to make sure you get those smoothed out before you get a lot of extra details cut in. Now, when I'm working with polyclay instead of putty, I tend to sculpt with it like clay instead of putty. And what I mean by that is I do a lot more of adding and subtracting, going back in. When you're working with putty, it's usually a better idea to really lock in the form, because whenever you have to add on additional material, it's much harder to add it on when it's in its middle of its curing state. If you have to add more on, I usually like to let it set up and cure, unless you are adding the material on almost as soon as you've started sculpting, because what'll happen is if you have a wet on wet, for lack of a better term, of putty, is you'll end up having two different levels of cure going on, and it can be hard to blend things together. But back to polyclay, you can see here as I added on a little more to the face, defined the mouth and the eyes a little further, I realized again the nose was too small It was a little too short. There wasn't enough material of it sticking out. So I'm just adding on a little more there and starting to blend that in as well. I gotta admit, I'm a little self-conscious about this demo that I'm sharing with you because I just feel like I approached this so poorly. You can see I'm adding on additional stuff again, but I wanted to show you it in this gritty detail that you can keep going. It's okay. Things don't always work out, but by the end of this, you'll see that you can come out with a really nice face with a good expression and all the proper details in there. So don't be scared to fight through. All right, I finally got the head into the proper shape. Mouth's looking a little rough, eyes are looking a little rough, but they are defined. I know where they go on the head and the proportions. You can see too, as I'm working with this Premo, it's definitely soft. You could see, normally when I'm sculpting with polyclay, like Female Professional, I don't see that sort of flex and bounce as much. It tends to hold its shape a little bit better. It's a little less rubbery, but this clay is definitely has those properties. But you'll see here in a minute as we move forward, I'm just going to do a little bit of extra smoothing out. I decided I was going to give a little bit of a smirk, so I switched to a scalpel just to have a little bit more control of the straight line of the face, or of the mouth, I should say. And just continue to refine some of those elements, clean things up before I put in the final touches on the eyes and mouth. Now that I have the whole head smoothed and shape defined, it's time for the last bit of detailing to really give this face some expression, and that comes around how you treat sort of the area of the eyebrows and the eye sockets. I like to use a very small spoon tool or burnisher, like you see here, to just very gently press in and have the rounded spoon part up and away from the eyes. That lets me kind of create a scoop shape where there's a little bit of a line defining above the eye and creates a nice little shelf there, and it separates the eyebrows from the eye and just naturally forms what looks a little bit like an eyelid. Now in this figure I decided to do larger eyes. There's several different ways you can do it, but I know a lot of painters really appreciate it. And when you're working with these small miniatures, even though this would be very large eyes for a real-life human, in miniature form, it really allows you the chance to get more expression out of the miniature when you're seeing it, especially down on the tabletop itself. So to summarize, I use scalpels and X-Acto knives to do the initial cuts in for details, but the real final refinements of details come with these small burnishers, needles, and you'll see that I use a kind of a blunted needle at times too. All those working together are my final fine-tuning detail tools that allow me to, accentuate a little detail, press in a bit more of shape, and it's very critical, especially when you're working on a face, with so many tiny details packed in there. So as I press in the final little details, one little cut here, a poke of the needle to really define the edges of the mouth and the eyes there, I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and I hope this video has been helpful, and let me know down in the comments what material you are enjoying sculpting with, or material that you have recently experimented with. Until next time, keep sculpting.